Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to talk about introverted versus extroverted intuition and what intuition is. Naturally, intuition is something that can't logically be explained. I've read many books and done and talked to many people trying to explain intuition, and I have failed. Uh, Intuition is something I intuitively understand. I've seen many people try to explain it, and to this day, I have not seen a single good definition of what the difference between extroverted and introverted intuition is. So, my first advice is if you really want to understand this, don't just watch this video and be like, oh, I got it, because you probably don't. In fact, I probably won't explain it and give it justice at all, but I'm going to do my best because it is a complex subject. It's out of all the cognitive functions, this is probably the hardest one to do, and naturally, me being an ENTJ, I want to do it first. So get the challenge out of the way, and the rest of it will come. So, introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. Okay, first off, intuition is possibilities. You're able to see you're able to basically feel what is not there. And the word feel, I'm using it loosely. You're able to sense what is not real, or what people would say, how do you know that kind of thing. There's a lot of confusion between the two, honestly. And honestly, they're total opposites, they're totally different, and they work in incredibly different ways. I'm going to start with extroverted intuition because, honestly, it's the one that I have a hard time understanding because I've never been this way. I'm a very poor extroverted intuitive. I think that's because my introverted intuition is very, very strong, and so I don't have a firm grasp of how extroverted intuition, how extroverted intuitives actually think, like what goes in their head. But I do have a friend who is an extroverted intuitive, and he is probably one of the most creative people I've ever met. He's an extroverted intuitive dominant, and he thinks on a way different level than I do when it comes to reading into what's actually happening. There's a disadvantage to extroverted intuition. It's excessively reading into something. That can be very overused by extroverted intuitives because they're able to see what's underneath very fast. They're quick. They're very quick. So when you have an extroverted intuitive, there's going to be this. Think of it like almost like a telescope. You have a broad world in front of you, and they're going to confine it to an idea, and then they're going to branch a bunch of ideas out of it. And they're going to keep branching a bunch of ideas, and they're unlimited ideas almost. And the one object in reality will link to another object, will link to another object, will link to another object, and then it'll link to another object. This is extremely evident in INTPs. I've noticed any INTP I've talked to, they're not a dominant extroverted intuitive, but because they're introverted thinkers and extroverted intuitives, they are the mind map masters. I'm telling you, these people are nuts. They'll take a concept that they'll read in something, say it's a scientific principle about anything, and then they'll break it into its logical facts. They'll draw this out too, by the way. They will draw the whole mind map, and they'll branch it down into 5 different, 7 different, 12 different, 14 different ideas that don't have anything to do with the original idea. And then they keep going and going and going, and the next thing you know, there's 50 pages in of these trees that make no sense. They've gone, and all of a sudden this person that was talking about a scientific principle is now talking about gummy bears. I don't know how they get there. And the point is, they just keep branching off into directions, and there's no end to it. It's extremely excruciating to watch. But I mean, it's fascinating because INTPs I've seen they're able to use that TI to map out the extroverted intuition, which is crazy looking. I mean, it looks insane. They're a real fan of that branch concept. I think is because it works for them. I've seen a lot of that with INTP types. So just think of the extroverted intuition as an explosion of ideas. It's consistent, but it's interrelationships between objects. You look at 10 objects in the environment, they're going to find a way that they all relate to each other. On the other hand, the introverted intuitive is totally different. The introverted intuitive is more like a microscope. You take a small object in the environment, and then you subjectively process that object in its relationship with whatever your subjective experience is with that object. and then it's stored away for further use. The thing about introverted intuitives is all about future possibility. Extroverted intuitives, on the other hand, are more about abstract, and they're more about possibilities that are not necessarily the future, but what's going on in that present moment in the relationships between those objects. An example, I'm going to jump back to extroverted and intuitive for this reason. An example is my friend, who's an extroverted intuitive, will be talking about boxing. Big fight this week in here, so he'll be talking about boxing, and then all of a sudden he'll move from boxing to the glove, and what they should do about the gloves, to what they do about their attire, to what the rules are, to how the rules should be changed, to the new ring, to a new mat, to a new facility, and somehow that moves to a new car, and then it moves to possibilities all between, and there's a relationship between everything. They're drawing these conclusions, and next thing you know is they're like, you know what, in their line would be, you know what would be cool, is if they had, and that's the extroverted intuitive line, is if they had, because they're thinking of possibilities externally. And not that I don't do this, it's very rare for me because I'm such a dominant introverted intuitive, but they're thinking about those, if it would be cool if, they built a park here and then they did this, and they love things that stimulate imagination, and they think of all possibilities. Like, honestly, my friend is a very mature person, but at the same time, he's like a kid. And he's all about the fantasy and the possibilities in the world and what you can do with it. And, and the other day he was talking about, having a home version of the Batmobile and an actual duplication of the Batmobile, I guess in the new movie coming out, and what he would do with it, and then getting the bat suit and how cool it would be, and all kinds of crazy stuff, and then what it would take to make it, and then what you could add to it. And that's kind of how the extroverted and intuitive thinks. I would never go down that road, honestly. It's just not the way my brain works. My brain works in a way of the introverted intuition, which is, I call it flashes of insight, is the best way to describe it. And this is why it's a flash of insight. I can look at something, and I can take an object, and I can see that object used for whatever reason. And then I have an experience that has nothing to do with that object, or an experience of the past, that something happened. And that experience reminds, and it's stored in my head. And at the same time, the new object triggers off this subjective experience, and then I create a relationship with the experience with that object. So it's not object between object and a reality. An extroverted intuitive would put a bunch of objects together and make a laser gun. They would be able to tie all those in and make something for it. They could see a cup and a pencil and a stapler, and they're like, oh, you know what? If we tied this together, we could come up with a bomb, or whatever they want to think. That's how they work. Me, that object would tie in not with other objects in reality, but it would tie into my subjective experience with something else, which creates flashes of insight, because I'm exposed to tons of objects, and you can perceive everything that's going on around you in the room. And when you do that through your sensory experiences, then you create relationships in your head, and then you're like, whoa, okay. And then all of a sudden you can be sitting there and boom, you get hit with this brilliant idea, like, whoa. And that's that introverted intuition. You're creating a subjective, and it has nothing to do with what was actually being said. A good example would be like, if you've ever seen House MD, he definitely used NI. I have arguments all over the internet about him using NE, but honestly, he wasn't the type of person that was NE oriented, and I'll explain why. He never had the explosion of ideas. He needed people to say things to stimulate his subjective experience in order for him to solve the problem. That indicates directly NI to its fullest extent. And so anybody who thinks he's NE, I think you're wrong. And that would be a whole nother discussion. But point is he needed that external stimulation, much like I do. I'm an NI dominant. And when I'm around people who think interesting thoughts. It relates to another thought that I had an experience about, or I had a subjective interpretation of, and then all of a sudden, boom, I can spit out something totally brilliant. And they say it's brilliant, and at the same time, and they're like, "When did you think of that? That sounds like you spent some serious time on that." I'm like, I just came up with it right now. And that's kind of what NI is it's a connection between the subjective impressions of the objects around you, and you're able to do that with NI. So flash of insight, like House MD, somebody would be talking to him about a personal relationship situation. He would cut him off, walk out of the room, and help the patient because he had this flash of insight. He would stop, and then he'd look around and he'd go, "Oh, wow, that's it," and then he'd solve the problem. And again, it needed that external that thought, and that's the possibility. Somebody may be talking about an affair they had in the show, and and that affair somehow had a subjective impression with his interpretation, and that linked to that particular medical disease that he understood, and he knew what was going on. NE doesn't work like that. NE does not work like that. NE is what is actually, the objects are external. They're outside of you. There's nothing to do with subjective impression. NE molds things together externally. They see a cup and a pencil and a baseball, and they're able to see how the objects can actually interrelate with each other, or ideas, same way. NE tends to be more creative. Like, if Dr. House was an NE user, he would probably be looking for new diagnoses versus searching back through old ones. He'd be saying, this is a brand new diagnosis, and here's why. And they'd be able to relate symptom A with symptom B, symptom C, symptom D, and symptom E, and say, this is a potential new diagnosis, and here's why. And they're able to link those particular objects in the external environment. And they would say that the symptom A is caused by a result of symptom C with symptom B, and that combination can potentially cause symptom A. On the other hand, NI doesn't work like that. NI is specifically based off subjective impression. So if I read a ton of medical books, I would know all of this different storehouse of information in my personal interpretation of those objects, and that knowledge in that book, and when to use it. So it's important that we do understand the difference between these, because then you can understand and appreciate people who use NE if you're an NI user, or vice versa. NE people are great with new ideas. NI tends to revise ideas and make ideas better, and they're future-oriented. NI is a predictive type of personality. NE is a very connective type of personality. So NI are known for future predictions. I can look at something and say, that's what's going to happen. I'm willing to bank on it. And people are like, how do you know that? I just know it. And all of a sudden it happens. And how did I know it? I don't know. It's just subjective impressions of things. And there are people who think you're a mystic with NI, like dominant NIs, like the INFJ or the INTJ. They blow my mind sometimes, because they're seen as almost like, people who can see into the future, which they really don't. It's just that subjective interpretation of all those ideas, and you're able to kind of plan things ahead. On the flip side, NE is more about connecting objects in reality and reading between the lines. So NE is like, that person is walking really slow, so that person must be depressed. That person is hunched over and he's walking really slow, so he's certainly got to be depressed. And so that's the possibility that he's depressed, and that's NE working. There's no actual evidence that he's depressed. It's just he had a hard life. That's an example of NE. And I could make the form the same conclusion, but I would form it off of subjective experience. I had 4 friends that walk like that. And again, this is me using TE, forming a logical conclusion. However, this is my NI backed with TE, rather TE backed with NI. I would look at that particular couple and say, that guy's walking hunched over in my experience. What I've seen from people in the past is if they walk like that, they have an office job, and B, they potentially are depressed. And, I've seen people who are confident, they walk more straight. And so my subjective experience would tell me that that's potentially that guy has a problem. And I've seen that it's mainly in relationships, and maybe he struggles with a particular problem at home with his wife or whatever it may be, and that's where NI goes. On the other hand, NE would say, okay, well, that guy, he's sick, he's depressed, and then it would relate to, or maybe he's just trying to keep his head out of the sun because the sun's bright, and the sun's bright, so you know what? If the sun's bright, how do we actually dim the sun? Oh, we could use this and this object here. If the tree had a little longer of a limb, it'd block out the sun, and that would create, a little more sunlight. Maybe he'd walk up straight, that kind of thing. And of course, I'm not great at impersonating NE because my NE sucks. I'm a NI user all the way, so it's funny when you see an NE because they just get so creative about things, and NE people are just explosive with ideas. They tend to start them but not finish them. Not always, but they tend to be very good at coming up with new ideas, but they don't have an implementation of it, so it's more abstract. NI is about future orientation and making a possibility happen, so that's typically why the INTJ and the ENTJ both want to win. Anyway, hope that's a good first explanation. I will imagine that this video will get comments that people will ask questions, and I'll probably have to remake it, which is fine. This is the difference between NE and NI part 1. So I'd imagine there will be a future version as I come across better ways to explain it. Thank you so much.